The Trumpet Daily from Jerusalem.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. Well, the dust has now settled on Egypt's dramatic transformation, and what do we see? We see a radical Islamist presiding over the biggest and most powerful state in the Arab world. We see Hamas celebrating in the streets of Gaza, and they're not alone in their celebrations. We see the Obama administration applauding the Muslim Brotherhood. President Obama himself called Mohamed Morsi to congratulate him on his victory. Morsi's political opponent, by the way, the one he beat in the presidential runoff, he's already fled the country. Shafiq loses a presidential election on a Sunday, and he's gone by Tuesday. You probably haven't heard much about that in the news. That's because we're supposed to believe that Egypt's transformation is a tremendous victory for democracy, that the Muslim Brotherhood is now peaceful and tolerant, that Morsi's administration will reach out to Christians and to women, and that if all else fails, the Egyptian military will maintain stability and balance because they have the guns. Let me read to you what Bret Stephens in the Wall Street Journal wrote on June 25th. He said, "Don't console yourself with the belief that the victory of the Muslim Brotherhood in the country's first free presidential election is merely symbolic, since the army still has the guns. The examples of revolutionary Iran and present-day Turkey show how easily the conscripts can be bought. The non-coms wooed and the officers purged." Now just look at what's happened in Iran and Turkey over the last few decades. These are lessons from our modern era. As Stephens points out in his column, he continued, "Don't console yourself with the idea that now the Islamists will have to prove themselves capable of governing the country. The Brotherhood is the most successful social organization in the Arab world. Its leaders are politically skillful, economically literate," it says, "and strategically patient. Its beliefs resonate with poor, rich, and middle class alike, and it can always use the army as a scapegoat should the economy fail to improve." So he says there that the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a terrorist organization, is also one that's politically skillful, highly organized, and very patient when it comes to implementing its radical agenda. And now it happens to control the most powerful nation in the Arab world. "Don't console yourself," finally, Stephens wrote, "with hope that Egypt will remain a responsible status quo player on the international scene. By degrees," he says, "Egypt under the Brotherhood will seek to arm Hamas and remilitarize the Sinai. By degrees," he says, "it will seek to extract concessions from the U.S. as the price of its good behavior. By degrees," he says, "it will make radical alliances in the Middle East and beyond." In other words, Egypt is now lost. Whether these radical steps are taken quickly or slowly, the outcome is inevitable. "It's going to be a long and ugly haul," Stephens wrote at the end of his article, "and it's just beginning." This is just the beginning of a radicalized Islamist state in Egypt. The prophetic implication of this transformation is momentous, and it was prophesied in your Bible, which is why we've been preparing you for this very transformation for going on 2 decades now. And now we see it's a reality. This prophecy has come to pass. It's been fulfilled. So the question is, where do we go from here? What happens next? Well, whenever you talk about the spread of radical Islam in the Middle East, you have to start with Iran. Iran may often clash with much of the Sunni Arab world, but in Egypt, specifically the Muslim Brotherhood, Iran sees a critically important strategic ally that will greatly strengthen the forces of radical Islam and further isolate Israel. After Morsi's victory, there was a report in the Iranian Fars news agency that quoted Morsi as saying he was interested in better relations with Tehran. and Morsi's administration later denied that report. But whatever the truth is about that report, you can be sure that Iran is working overtime to build an unshakable alliance with the new Egypt. Now, added to that, think about how the impact of Morsi's victory on this area of the world, think about the impact right here in East Jerusalem, or in the West Bank, just beyond these hills, or in Gaza to our west. Morsi's win represents a massive strategic victory for Hamas. This is why they were dancing in the streets and firing live ammunition when the election results were finally released. Now, over the past year, Morsi has met with Hamas officials several times in Egypt. He's promised to ease restrictions at the border between Egypt and Gaza. And what does that mean, ultimately? It means that the flow of weapons into Gaza will surely increase. Quoting from the Associated Press, this is June 25th, it says, "A complete opening of the Gaza-Egypt border, including trade, would also have the unintended consequence of deepening the separation between the West Bank and Gaza. Regime change in Egypt hits Abbas," that's speaking of Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian leader over here in the West Bank. This regime change in Egypt hits Abbas at a time when he's increasingly isolated and irrelevant. And so who do you think wins in the struggle between Hamas and Fatah? I think you probably know the answer to that question. Right after Hamas's violent overthrow of Gaza back in June of 2007, my father wrote in a coworker letter that the Palestinian civil war, quote, "should be sending alarm bells throughout the Western world." Iran, he went on to say, had just taken over Gaza. What is going to be Iran's next move? That's what my father asked in that letter. Probably, he wrote, to take over the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. He said the Fatah Muslims have the upper hand over Hamas in East Jerusalem, but their control is shaky. Hamas could and probably will get control of the West Bank soon, as they did in Gaza. That was in 2007. I mean, back then you could see the handwriting on the wall. Once Hamas gained control of Gaza and started to get rid of Fatah by throwing them off of buildings and such, you could see the handwriting on the wall back then. But now with an Islamist Egypt strengthening ties with Iran and Hamas, how much longer do you suppose it will be before we have an Islamist West Bank, before we have an Islamist East Jerusalem? Remember the pro-Morsi campaign from May, in which Egyptian cleric Safwat Higazi told tens of thousands of cheering Brotherhood members that Jerusalem would become the new capital of an Arab empire. He screamed millions of martyrs to march toward Jerusalem. Who could forget that speech? Do you think Israel forgets about that? Do you think the little nation of Israel here takes these threats seriously? Do you think the Knesset is optimistic about maintaining peace with the Muslim Brotherhood? Now, of course, the official reaction to Morsi's victory has been somewhat restrained here in Israel, but the unofficial reaction has been almost unanimous shock and dismay over what's happening in Cairo, over what's happening in Egypt, which borders Israel in the south. The Israeli papers are calling Morsi's election a plague of darkness. That was in one of the editorials. Another columnist wrote, "The day may not be far off when the cornerstones of the fragile peace with Egypt are smashed once and for all. It is expected that within 6 months, we will see Egypt's true colors." Former Israeli ambassador to Egypt, Tzvi Mazel, predicts Morsi's hold on power will only strengthen over time. As the Times of Israel wrote on June 24th, Mazel said the incoming president would likely reinstall the Islamist-dominated parliament that was dissolved earlier this month by Egypt's interim military rulers, and within 6 months, Egypt's powerful generals would be replaced by figures loyal to the Brotherhood. That's what he estimates. That's the former ambassador to Egypt. at Ma'ariv, another Israeli newspaper, one columnist there wrote, "It's over. The army will remain in a position of influence, but its time has passed. The street, tradition, religion, the inbuilt Islamist identity, all of these have ridden roughshod over hope, which has been turned into an illusion. Tunisia and Libya have fallen. Now it's Egypt's turn." At Israel Hayom, another columnist wrote this. He said the difficulties that Morsi faces will emerge gradually when he finds it hard to bridge the gap between Egypt's political and economic interests and the disappointment of the masses. He may be forced to take populist measures, and in the Middle East, this usually means inciting against Israel. It is easy to envisage Morsi emulating the Islamic Republic of Iran. When you look at all of these prophetic events swirling around this very region, you can see that there just aren't any positive scenarios for Israel. Israel's choices really range between bad and worse, which is why Israel has been quietly, according to the Jerusalem Post, it's been quietly preparing for war with Egypt. And of course, we know there's going to be quite a few other nations involved in conflict in this very region. Let's notice a couple of verses here before we conclude. In the book of Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah, chapter 14, in the short run, war is coming to the Middle East. In fact, the prophecies tell us, and Zechariah 14 itself confirms, that war is coming to this very city, the city you see behind me, the city of Jerusalem. We quoted last year from Carolyn Glick at thetrumpet.com. This is from June 17th, 2011, and this was just a few months into the Arab Spring. As she saw all of these events happening around Israel, Ms. Glick wrote, "What this means is that, as was the case in May 1967, when the combined Arab armies gathered with the express purpose of wiping the Jewish state off the map, today," she says, "again, Israel is alone at its hour of greatest peril. As was the case in May 1967, Israel has arrived at a do-or-die moment, and we should all pray for the strength and courage of our leaders, our soldiers, and our nation at this time." It's not often that you hear a columnist or read from a columnist encouraging us to pray for the leaders, to pray for the military, to pray for the nation. Why aren't there more people calling on the Israelis or the Americans or whoever else to pray for these conditions that we see worsening by the day? Every day it's worsening. But those of us that are students of the Bible, we can know and be encouraged by these developments in many ways because we know what it's building toward. Ultimately, there is good news in the end. Zechariah 14, here in verse 2, it says this, "For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished," it says, "and half the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city." Now here in Zechariah 14, Jesus Christ prophesies that he's going to gather all nations to Jerusalem. This hasn't happened yet. This will happen in the near future. He's going to gather all nations to Jerusalem for what? To battle, it says there. It's a prophecy about the military forces of this world gathering to fight against each other initially, but ultimately they're going to turn their attention to Jesus Christ at his return. That too is brought out in Zechariah 14. As Zechariah points out, gathering the nations actually begins with half the city of Jerusalem falling to the forces of radical Islam. We just read that in verse 2. It's that event that triggers a series of events that leads to Jesus Christ's return. It all revolves around Christ, and it begins and it ends in Jerusalem. Now, if you understand about this prophesied division of this city, then from there you can continue your study right over in Daniel 11 and other passages of the Bible in the New Testament, the Gospels, where Jesus himself talked about armies surrounding this city. But over in Daniel 11, toward the end of that chapter, you have a step-by-step preview of what happens leading right up to Jesus Christ's appearance on the Mount of Olives, which is where I'm standing right here today, on this mount. Staying here in Zechariah 14, notice verse 4, it says, "And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west. And there shall be a very great valley, and half the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south." So war is coming, definitely. It's coming to the Middle East, but it will culminate in this blessed event, the return of Jesus Christ to Jerusalem. This is why what we see happening in the Middle East is so significant and in so many ways thrilling when you think of the prophecies being fulfilled and where it's leading. The radicalization of Egypt is an important step toward the now imminent return of Jesus Christ. All of these events are tied directly to the second coming of Jesus Christ. To learn more about the prophetic events we discuss often on this program, the ones we now see unfolding before us, be sure and obtain your free copy of an article we wrote a few years ago, Jerusalem, How the Violence in Jerusalem Triggers Christ's Return. And of course also we have the King of the South booklet, which you need to read and study as well, so you know what's coming, so you know what's next. Now we'll also be having some regular updates right here from Jerusalem over the summer, both in the form of video like you're seeing here today, and also audio podcasts, which we've put together a few of, to keep up with those and to learn more about our many websites and what we're offering you, the listener or the viewer, over the course of this summer. Just check in at StephenFlurry.com or some of our other websites at thetrumpetdaily.com or, of course, thetrumpet.com. Any of those can keep you posted on what we're reporting on the scene and direct from the pages of your Bible. Thank you, as always, for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.